Welcome back to the Pursuit Podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about accessibility and text for the web, how to write to make your words as accessible as possible. I'm here today with...
Hi, this is Ashley Bischoff, and I'm a accessibility analyst as well as a copy editor for the Paciello Group.
And many times when people talk about accessibility, they're talking about the design of a site, the way you navigate. But today we're going to be focusing on accessibility in writing and readability.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that for a lot of us who work in coding a lot of the time, it could be easy to lose sight of how much we actually write. And that may be emails, it may be documentation, it may be reports, but a lot of us actually write a fair bit, and being able to write so that people can understand what we've written can make a big difference.
When we talk about accessibility in the space of writing for the web, what kinds of challenges could we be helping people navigate through?
Sure. I mean, one example that comes to mind is people who may have cognitive disabilities, but on top of that, all of us have our day-to-day strains in life. We may be worried about how our kid's going to do on their math test next week, or maybe we didn't sleep so well last night. So a lot of us have these day-to-day strains and activities that take up our brain space. And in that way, if we can write in a way that's easier for people to understand, that helps out everyone.
Fantastic. So if you're sitting down with someone for the first time and having a look at something they've written, what are some of the big top-level things you say, let's address this first?
One of the big ones that I look at is sentence length, because in a sense, when you have a long sentence with perhaps clauses or parentheses or things like that, for someone who's on the reading end of it, it's quite possible that their brain may have to ingest the whole sentence before piecing it together, figuring it out, and generally piecing together how that sentence works. So I think one of the big things that I look at is just the length of sentences. And experts who study understandability and readability of language recommend keeping sentences to between 20 and 25 words. Even just doing that can help tremendously with how readable our sentences are. With that said, that's not to say that you can't have longer or shorter sentences. I would recommend staying for an average around 20-some words, but with that said, yeah, you may as well have a few 35-word sentences, maybe a few 3-word sentences. I think that many things just aim for an average around then, and that can actually go a long way.
So for folks who haven't really thought about accessibility in text before, being told aim for an average of 25 words in a sentence can sound a bit daunting. I think at first there may be questions about should we just count? That's not very practical. Is there any tooling you recommend for this?
Sure. There is, one option out there is if you happen to be writing in Word, if you select the text that you've just written and you look in the status bar of Word, it will tell you the length of how many words you've just selected. Another tool that's handy is one that's called the Readability Analyzer. You can get to that at bit.ly/reading analyzer. And it's a free website where you can just paste your text into a box, and it'll give you various calculations like the average number of words per sentences and that sort of thing. And so that actually makes it a bit easier than having to count things out by hand. So little tools like that can make a difference there.
That sounds like a really fantastic tool. We'll go ahead and we'll include that in the show notes as well. That's bit.ly.com.
This is from the top level domain of Libya, which is ly. So it's bit.ly/reading analyzer. And that's reading analyzer with a Z using the American English spelling of analyzer.
What other things aside from sentence length would you encourage people to have a look at? You say, do you know what? I'm building the biggest new thing. I want everyone to be able to access it. I want everyone to read this, everyone to share it. What kinds of things do I have to keep in mind that aren't just sentence length?
Another area that I would look at is the number of syllables per word. You can sort of think of syllables as being sort of like Tetris pieces in a way. Just to extend that metaphor, perhaps a 2-syllable word might be like a Tetris piece with 3 blocks in it. So like one of those lines or the L shape. A 3-syllable word might be like a 5-block Tetris piece and so on. And so as you can imagine, if you were the person trying to play this Tetris game, it could get quite tiresome to try to work with all these large pieces if they came at you all the time. So
cognitively trying to fit in these larger, more complex pieces.
Exactly. And along those same lines, I also wanted to acknowledge that there are some words that are just big and perhaps unavoidable. For instance, the word accessibility has 6 syllables. But if you're writing about accessibility, you probably have to use the word accessibility.
At least once.
Yeah, probably. I mean, there are other words like documentation, which has 5 syllables. So there are times where it may be unavoidable, and that's okay. But generally, I recommend using words with fewer syllables if you can. So as one example, you might have the word however at the beginning of a sentence. But rather than saying however, you could say but.
Oh.
Yeah.
So really going ahead and writing out your copy, having a good idea of what you want to say, and then coming in with a critical eye and saying, let's make this shorter, let's make this easier as part of your process.
Right. So with all that said, I realized that this is something that might at first seem a little bit daunting, but if you look at a bunch of copy and trying to optimize it and make it more readable, I think perhaps even just as a first step, rather than worrying about every single word, one option might be to look at, say, the words that are 3 and 4 syllables and just try to work on those. Perhaps words that are 5 syllables. And that way you could just chip away at it rather than trying to eat the whole hamburger in one bite.
And it sounds like these might overlap a lot with a lot of guidelines that just for better writing in general.
That's absolutely true.
Make it shorter, make it clearer.
Right. Of course, I think advice like make it clear is fantastic in the general sense. Of course, it's a bit like asking someone to drive better in the sense that everyone paradoxically thinks that they're an above average driver, even though statistically that is impossible. In the same way, almost everyone thinks that they're a pretty good writer who writes clearly. So advice like write clearly can sometimes not always get through to people, just since most people seem to think that they already write clearly.
Do a great job. You're like, well, I'm doing a great job. I'm done.
Exactly. It's like saying to someone, hey, be awesome. And they're like, well, check, got that covered.
So let's give better advice than be awesome.
Right.
So we've got really practical advice from you so far. We're going to be taking a look at our sentence length, making sure we trim that down, keeping our words shorter if possible.
Yeah.
Is there any other advice that you have that's especially helpful? Reducing the number of idioms, for example? Is there anything that's especially useful for folks who are maybe non-native speakers reading your writing?
One bit of advice that I can share that is kind of a secret weapon in a way is I recommend using contractions as often as you do in real life. So as many of us are aware, contractions would be, for instance, changing do not into don't, or cannot into can't. And that's one of those things where that can actually make a remarkable difference in how easy it is to read what someone has written. And on top of that, it also helps people understand what you've written if they may be skimming what you've written. Because for someone who may be skimming over something, if you had avoided contractions and you had said do not, if perhaps their eye catches the do but misses the not, then that might completely change their impression of your sentence. But if you have something like don't, where it's a single word, that kind of prevents that because they would catch the don't and there's no way to miss the not because it's already built in. So that's just one area where that can make a big difference. And not to mention, of course, that contractions are one of those things that kind of make people sound like robots. Like if you've ever seen one of those sci-fi robot movies from the 50s where you've got robots that are attacking humans. And I mean, robots in those movies say something like, I will be glad to see them if they do not get mad. I mean, rather than just something like, I'll be glad to see them if they don't get mad, which just sounds so much more natural.
So folks who might be going for a more formal tone, do not, could not, perhaps, might be making themselves sound a little bit tinned or robotic in the process.
Exactly. And I think that oftentimes people tend to fall back onto more formal language when they're unsure of what they're writing. And one example of this is something where you've got perhaps tax forms or the like, or maybe a letter from your bank where someone is trying to sound self-important, but they're actually just sending you some benign letter. And so in that way, you can actually play against that, where if you write the way that you talk, such as using contractions and so on, that actually makes you sound more authoritative, more confident, and it helps you get through to your readers. So in that way, writing formally can actually have the opposite effect that one might intend.
Have you, and this is a little bit of a sidebar and maybe a weird one, have you ever read any novels by Cormac McCarthy?
I haven't. Should I?
Okay. Well, possibly. He writes in a style that's very short and clipped and direct and short words.
Oh.
And it sounds very much to overlap with a lot of your advice. He'll do glorious monstrosities of run-on sentences, which we clearly don't want people doing. But it sounds like a lot of your advice. Write the way you would speak, write naturally. Mm-hmm. And when you do this, you sound more in control of your own language, more authoritative. Sounds a lot like some of the McCarthy novels.
Yeah, I think you might be onto something there. I will have to check those out. Is there one of his books you'd recommend as a starter?
I think No Country for Old Men is one a lot of people will know because I believe that was a movie as well.
Is that the one with the milkshake?
I didn't see the movie.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I'm terrible with movies. It's a good book,
fine.
Though.
Yeah, sweet.
If you like Western-themed violence.
Okay. Is it like sci-fi Western or is it like Western?
No, Western.
Oh, okay.
So I'm kind of wanting to walk back on my advice to tell people writing documentation or emails to write a bit like Cormac McCarthy.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair enough. Yeah.
You'd be like, download this package, he said, knocking his dusty boots against the wall. Now. So it sounds like you get to do a lot of really interesting work. Can you talk to me a little bit about what an average day or an average week looks like for you, helping clients through making their writing more accessible?
Sure. I think a lot of what I do is in terms of writing is, for instance, clients may have written up some documentation on even just for internal procedures on maybe how to use their CMS or something like that. And when I go through and copy edit it, I try to work with it and revise the writing so that it speaks to people the way that you would speak to someone in real life. And one metaphor that I kind of go with and advice that I give to some clients as well is to imagine if you were at a backyard barbecue and you're sitting at a picnic table across from someone and this person across the table was your client or your customer or whoever, and to imagine yourself sitting there and talking just as you would normally, and then take those words and then write those down. Because the way that people talk in real life is actually pretty understandable. But a lot of people sometimes get a bit mixed up and it can be easy to overthink one's writing and it can end up being more stuffy than it needs to be.
So it sounds like you don't just work with your clients on their copy, but you work with your clients to try and convince them to talk to their users or their customers or their peers as if they were humans.
Exactly. And the way that I think of it is that, sure, it's important to offer advice that's accurate and correct, but in a way, it doesn't matter how accurate the advice is if the people who are on the receiving end don't understand what you're trying to say. It can make a big difference to write in a way that is colloquial, conversational, because that really helps to get through to readers.
You've absolutely convinced me. And I imagine that you may well have convinced our dear listener as well. But what about helping our dear listener convince their boss or convince their copy department or convince their UX writer or their content creators? What kinds of common speed bumps or issues or barriers do you find in converting folks that we can warn our dear listener to look out for?
I think sometimes when people go to talk to their bosses or go to talk to their writing partners, that there could be some resistance at times because people are used to doing things a certain way. But with that said, I think for something like contractions, for example, that's something where, sure, writing recommendations may have shied away from contractions in the past, but I think that's something that's actually really come around. And in fact, in studies that have been done of contemporary writing sources like newspapers and magazines and TV transcripts, you'll find, for example, that don't is used almost 8 times more often than do not. And for instance, can't is used almost 3 times more often than cannot. And so all that is to say, I'm not necessarily recommending that people trot out statistics, but I think that if you bring in contemporary sources, such as perhaps the Washington Post or Time Magazine or the San Francisco Chronicle or what have you, just by looking through those and seeing how contemporary writers write today, I think you'll find that a lot of this advice is currently in the mainstream among writing today. And in that sense, we can make use of that to show perhaps writing partners or copywriters, this is kind of how people are writing. And this is how people are used to writing today.
And you've touched on something which I think is really interesting. It can be really scary to bring forward a suggestion or bring forward a new way of working when it feels like you're criticizing someone's writing in any way. Please do correct me if I'm wrong, but folks working in writing spaces, be it technical writing or copywriting, does writing still feel very much like a creative process?
I think that's something where you may have to ask the individual, where in the same way you could ask a web designer, does web design still feel like a creative process? And I think for some people, it hopefully would, whereas perhaps for others, maybe those at corporate enterprise visual designers, maybe they don't feel that as much. But I would like to think that in energetic writing environments, people with enthusiasm for writing, I think there is that creativity there. And I think that makes a big difference.
Yeah, I think that in places where writing for the web is seen as a creative act, I'd be really nervous about bringing something that feels like criticism. I love your suggestion that you bring in a contemporary source and sort of offer that as almost a gentle or passive suggestion. Hey, have you seen this? Oh, I just saw this article. Oh, I just listened to this podcast with this wonderful Ashley woman. So give people the suggestion without sort of a critique that comes with it.
Right. And I think as well that much in the same way that a skilled visual designer is accustomed to keeping up with the latest design trends and the latest design work that's out there, that in the same way, copy editors and copywriters who are at the top of their craft similarly keep up with the way that people are writing today and the way that writing can be written that works for readers. So I would like to think that if a team has a dedicated copywriting department or a content creation group, with any luck, hopefully they'll be keeping up with some of these. Though I realize as well that there are some companies or groups where perhaps there might not be a dedicated copywriter, but perhaps someone who does copywriting now and again as part of other duties of their job. And that could be an area where maybe they don't keep up as much with some of the more recent trends in writing.
That's a fantastic point. We're looking at the split between folks who are professional writers, who focus on writing for the web, who focus on copy, versus the lovely person on the product team of a startup or the intern looking at a feature. And having different expectations around those is really practical.
I think so. And as well, writing is one of those things that can be deceptively tricky at times because all of us write. And so it can be easy to think that all of us should write. But just to pick another example, in a field like visual design, that's something where it could be a much easier sell to say, hey, we should hire a visual designer because most people don't have visual design skills. But on the other hand, with writing, all of us write. And so sometimes it could be perhaps less intuitive to think, hey, we should hire someone who's an expert at this, because many people think that they can perhaps get by with using anyone as a writer. But I think that writing and copy editing as well are skills that they are specialized, and they are something where if you can hire someone who's really good at it, that can go a long way. And having a dedicated writer can make that difference.
So if you're really looking to get professional level output in writing for the web, you should probably involve a professional when you're able to.
I would entirely agree. And even not so much if you're looking for professional level output. But if you were making a website where you're hoping to make a profit off of whatever the website is for, I think it's worth having professionals in every area that's involved with that product. So including things like project managers and visual designers and so on, but also copywriters, copy editors who can make your writing as good as it can be.
I want to chat really briefly about something that's occasionally controversial in accessibility in writing. To dive a little bit deeper into tooling and different ways you can support this, I understand that there's some kind of grading level check for writing?
Yes, there are a number of algorithms, but one of the more popular ones is the Flesch-Kincaid reading grade level. That's an algorithm that takes factors such as the average number of syllables per word, the average length of sentences, and it calculates the reading grade, the level of education that someone would need to be able to understand that text. I should offer a caveat that the Flesch-Kincaid reading grade level is based off of the U.S. educational grades. So in the U.S., for example, the public school goes from 1 through 12, and then university goes from 13 through, well, however many years of university you might like to take.
And so that's just going to give me a score if I use that and say, oh, do you know what? This is written at the 6th grade level, or this is written at the 12th grade level.
Right. That's something where it could be easy to think, well, perhaps the customers for a given site might have a public school education, which would be 12 years. So it can be tempting to think, oh, well, my writing, if it's as long as it's less than 12, it'll be fine. But actually, it turns out from people who study this sort of thing that people can comfortably read at usually 4 to 5 years below their maximum education level. So, for example, someone who may have graduated from high school in the United States, which would be 12 years of schooling, they could comfortably read at perhaps around a grade level of 9. And the reason for that is because the Flesch-Kincaid reading grade level works off of an ideal context where perhaps if you had a great night's sleep last night and you remembered to eat breakfast in the morning and you didn't have much traffic on the way into work, and when you got to the office, you were sitting in a quiet room with good lighting, maybe you could read at your reading grade level of your education. But the thing is that life isn't this ideal condition, that maybe you didn't quite sleep very well last night, or maybe you forgot to eat breakfast, or maybe there was traffic on the way into work, or maybe once you got into work, there was some dude on his cell phone on the next cube over, or maybe you had some flickering lights overhead. And all of these factors serve to tug down our maximum reading level. And so that's why for someone who's graduated from high school, which would be 12 years, a grade level such as 9 would be more suitable. Similarly, for someone who may have a bachelor's degree, which would be ostensibly 16 years of schooling, they might be more comfortable at a reading grade level of maybe 10 or so. And so that's why you kind of need to take into account how real life can affect your readers' reading levels.
So it sounds very much like the Flesch-Kincaid test relies on you bringing your best version of yourself to get stuff done every day. And well, to be terribly honest, I don't remember the last time I've brought the best version of myself to the web.
Right. And I think that on top of that, the Flesch-Kincaid reading grade level, it perhaps not so much relies on someone bringing their best self, but it says that here is the high watermark for writing that you could potentially understand under ideal conditions. And so the Flesch-Kincaid reading grade level relies on writers to take that into account and to aim for a reading grade level that's perhaps 4 to 5 years below the maximum education level that your readers may have gone through.
Is there ever sort of the risk of giving someone this tool and having them use it in a counterintuitive way? Say, hey, here's something that will check the difficulty of your language. And having a client or having someone in your office say, oh, wow, well, we're building a product for really smart people, so let's make sure that this is a really high score.
I think that's an excellent example. where perhaps you have an audience where the majority of them have graduated from a university, which would be ostensibly reading grade of 16. And so it might be tempting for some to aim for a reading grade level of 14 or 15 or 16. But given that most people can only comfortably read 4 to 5 years below their maximum education level, if you were to be writing at a 14 grade reading level, that would be way too difficult to understand for most people with even a college degree. On top of that, it can be tempting to think to yourself, oh, I should have a reading grade level that's up at the higher end of the education level of my readers. But in reality, I think there's a lot of benefit to aiming for a reading grade level that's perhaps more around 7 or 8 or 9, because what that does is it makes your writing easier to read. And at the end of the day, no one has ever complained that something was too easy to read. So I wouldn't worry about writing that may have a reading grade level of being, quote, too low, because if you can get something that's on the lower scale, that's actually great. Go for it.
So you're suggesting that having it be simpler and having it be easier to read is much better than sort of James Joycing at your audience, giving them something that's deliberately challenging because you're not trying to challenge them. You're trying to communicate your message.
Right, exactly. Where if you have, say, documentation for an alarm clock that you're selling, you want people to understand how they can set the time and how they can set the alarm. And using flowery language is probably not really what they're looking for when they buy that sort of product.
And if you're writing for the web, everybody wants every customer possible, every user possible. Giving them a high bar, a high barrier to entry to even learn what you do is probably a bit of a mistake.
Exactly. And I think that on the web as well, so many of us have an attention span that can be drawn away by many other things, where we may have a web browser open, but perhaps you also have Twitter open, maybe you have Facebook on your phone.
Oh, I absolutely have Twitter open.
Exactly. And so in that way, if a web page starts to bore us, it can be all too easy for our eyes to glance over to Twitterific or to Tweetbot or to other applications. And at that point, well, if you've lost your reader, you may have lost the sale.
So that's a fantastic point. If you're writing for the web and you can't convince your team that accessibility is an issue here or readability is an issue here, convince them that letting your potential customers get bored or your potential readers get bored might be a good route to conversion.
I think that's a good way of thinking about it. And in that way, that's also still working with the readability angle, but just perhaps from the other side of the coin. And if that works for you, go for it.
This has been a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate you joining us. If you wanted to give any last parting advice or reiterate any of your points or yell at an imaginary listener who's been doing these things that you'd like them to stop, what would you like to leave us with?
Well, I thought, hey, let's just recap some of the advice since people may have, people may be distracted by real life distractions. So I would recommend going for an average sentence length of somewhere around 20 some words. I would keep an eye out for words that are 3 and 4 syllables if you're just looking at a block of text. And I would also recommend using contractions early and often, just like you do in real life. And then, of course, there's also the readability analyzer, and that can help give you a better idea for how your text is holding up.
Fantastic advice. I hope that the web as a whole gets increasingly readable. Thank you very much.
I hope so too. My pleasure, Jess.